Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Is everyone having a good time? Yes? It's been amazing speakers so far. My name is Andrea Bertone. I'm the director of the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Hub at FHI 360 here. And we're delighted to be one of the sponsors of the Wild Network Forum. And I've been working with Fiona over the last several months, and it's just so amazing to see the fruits of many months of engagement and discussions and meetings. So so pleased for her and for the network, but also for us as we're a movement now, apparently. Yes. So I'm here with my colleague, and I'll have her introduce herself as well. Did you turn it on?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see you all. My name is Blessed Mulenga Sulavwe. I'm from the FHI 360 office in Zambia, and I'm also part of the Gender Hub. I work under the Safeguarding Subcommittee, so I'll be co-presenting with Andrea today.
Yes. So we're going to talk about organizational leadership in preventing sexual exploit and responding to all forms of harassment, abuse, and exploitation. And what I hope to do is to talk about the journey that FHI 360 has taken over the last 16 months or so in our efforts to really look at ourselves, look internally, look to see what we needed to change, what was working, what wasn't working with regard to safeguarding. And of course, we've all been moved by what has been going on in the international development sector with regard to harassment and abuse and exploitation. And for us, just as much as many organizations, we needed to kind of take a look at what we had been doing and to see what does safeguarding mean for us. So just a very brief overview. Safeguarding is an umbrella term that encompasses protecting program participants from sexual exploitation and abuse, generally at the hands of aid workers or anyone who's working for our organizations, consultants, partners, volunteers, etc. And then protecting the workers against harassment and abuse that could be taking place at the hands of other colleagues or other people that we work with. So we're looking at protecting and responding and preventing this type of behavior that happens. We know that it happens in our work on a daily basis. Some foundations for creating effective safeguarding policies. We've had many conversations internally, and I'll go through kind of how we were structured in a moment, but these were some of the foundations that we discussed that were necessary to create effective safeguarding policies. FHI 360, at the beginning of 2018, we had several policies that governed behavior of colleagues within the work environment. These policies covered harassment and violence in the workplace. And in our discussions, we realized, well, the workplace is more than just the office, right? The work environment is much more broad because we're traveling, we work in the communities, we are perhaps seconded to ministries, and so our work environment is very broad. And so we started redefining what it means, a work environment. And we also realized that we did not have a policy that was strongly enough protecting our program participants. So at the beginning of January 2018, we looked at our policy landscape and decided we needed to improve and strengthen our harassment policies. We needed to improve and strengthen our violence in the work environment policy, and we also needed a new policy on protecting program participants from sexual exploitation and abuse. And these were some of the foundations that we realized this is what we need for better policy, better approaches. Of course, they needed to be survivor-centered. That was first and foremost part of the discussions, that we really needed to be focused on the individuals who might be experiencing this. And that was a shift in discussion because many times it's about the organization, and we really wanted to put the focus on the people who are being affected. We wanted the policies to be well researched, we wanted them to be thoughtful, and we wanted them to have an understanding of the cultural context. Of course, they needed to be inclusive. We needed to broaden the number of people that we were thinking about that could be victims, survivors, and also that could be perpetrating these behaviors. Of course, these policies had to have an element of prevention and response. We needed to be looking at how are we preventing this, how are we putting structures in place that are going to address the work environment, and also the structures of response, reporting, investigating, providing care and support to survivors of this kind of behavior. We needed these policies to adhere to universal principles of human rights, first and foremost. And finally, we of course, we had to abide by regulatory commitments. So USAID, DFID, and other donors were also rolling down very much more stringent requirements on what implementing partners were supposed to be doing with regard to this kind of behavior. This is very difficult to read, so I will walk you through it. But essentially, it's our journey over the last 16 months or so. Whoops, sorry about that. One of the key components of the journey was the partnerships that we created internally that were comprised of Human Resource Department, the Jessie Hub, so my team and the network of gender specialists and social inclusion specialists across the organization. Our crisis response team, so this is a team at FHI 360 that has been doing humanitarian response work. So they were involved in these conversations. And we worked collaboratively over the course of many months to start creating that foundation, like the principles that I just showed you. We had many discussions, what are the things that are driving us and what do we want to make sure that these policies reflect. So we had many meetings over the course of many months. And we also realized that there was going to be necessary to shift some focus of our top leadership, because we hadn't really had very deep conversations with our CEO and our COO and many others about the need for improved policies. We knew that they were engaging with leaders in other organizations about these issues, and we needed an approach to come to them and say, you know what, we really need to rethink our policies. And we thought, what's going to resonate with them? Well, at FHI 360, our tagline is the science of improving lives. And we come to the work that we do with an evidence-based approach. We do a lot of research. We're well known for our health research. So we thought to ourselves, if, for example, a donor came to FHI 360 and said, we're going to pay you to improve your safeguarding policies, how would we approach that? So we thought, well, we're going to sort of create, a project-based approach to this. We're going to start with a work plan. We're going to figure out what our resources are. And so we brought this to the attention of our CEO, Patrick Fine, and Debbie Kennedy, who many of you just heard in the plenary panel. And we thought if we approach it that way, maybe that would resonate to them that, we really need an approach that's going to be very evidence-based and very methodical. But it's not just about methods, it's about passion also. So we had a lot of very passionate individuals who were working with us who had a background in gender-based violence, in human rights, in humanitarian crisis response. So we kind of brought together the commitments, the passion, and the methodical approach, and we kind of brought it all together in a presentation to our senior leadership. And we were able to make the case to Patrick Fine that we needed new policies, and which was really great. And that, as soon as he kind of came on board with the realization, that really launched us to fast track the updating of our policies. So as I mentioned, so in January of 2019, we were able to launch 2 revised policies, so harassment in the work environment and violence in the work environment. And we have a new policy on protecting program participants from sexual exploitation and abuse. And so we created this this kind of structure to explain, what are FHI 360 values for addressing safeguarding. Of course, we need the management and coordination. So now that we have the policies, well, that's just the first step. We need now to implement these policies. We need to promote them across the organization. We have 60 country offices. We have 5,000 staff. So how do you roll these important policies out to all of our countries, which Blessed is going to talk about in a moment. Of course, we have to have a prevention pillar, the policy, the response pillar, and then of course the community engagement, which is for us a little bit new. And so, creating the community complaint mechanisms and ensuring that staff are trained and that we have all of those systems in place are really important next steps for our implementation of the process. We have many policies at FHI 360 that support a safe and respectful work environment. I'm listing many of them. I listed a dress code. It's a little controversial to write that down, but this is not an easy topic. So I write it because in many countries where I've traveled, they always bring up a dress code. They always want to talk about the dress code. And I think that it's important to make sure we're addressing the things that are contextual and of the interest, but recognizing, of course, that we don't want to blame anyone for the way they dress for the behavior that happens, but it is a topic that comes up, so I'm listing it because people want to talk about it. One of the other things that has come to our attention is and I'll point your attention to the last bullet first, is the intersection of our equity, diversity, and inclusion initiative, our gender and social inclusion work, and our safeguarding work. And so these are some conversations now that we're starting to have to figure out, well, this really goes beyond just having great policies on the books. We are talking about creating a safe and equitable work environment for everyone to feel included. And how do you do that? How do you do that in very diverse places, in different kinds of country offices, and how do you bring together the work that we're doing to promote at the organizational level with the work that we do in our programs? So one thing that, as the director of our Jesse Hub, I'm always promoting, well, we have to walk the talk. We can't just talk about gender integration in our programs without having equitable work environments, having principles and policies related to gender equality and social inclusion. And so we believe that all of these things actually work hand in hand. So one of the next steps in our discussions around the rollout of our policies is trying to figure out the intersections of these issues at a large organization. And so, this is terribly too much text, but what I would like to do, though, is just to call out a couple of things on this slide, which is essentially just the power dynamics. Okay, so if you look at it at the really at the core issues, like what are the issues around power? And for me, that is like that center, that core of the Venn diagram is the power dynamics. So if we, the specific power dynamics in an organization's impacts how we're designing our programs, and that has to do with whether or not we've integrated gender. Are we doing a gender and social inclusion analysis? Are we hiring staff who can promote this work? Are we creating indicators for measuring JESI? Are we monitoring the work that we're supposed to be doing? All of the design of programs. And how are the projects being implemented? Are we including people with disabilities? Are we engaging young people? Are we trying to empower women and girls in the projects? Are we engaging men in a thoughtful and effective way? This is all about power for us. And then how do we promote the interaction of our staff? Are we promoting equitable work environments for our staff across our country offices? So for us, it's really about the power dynamics, honestly. And then trying to figure out the operationalization. So I'm going to say one last thing, and I'm going to turn it over to Blessed. One of the ongoing conversations that we've had at HQ is how do we engage our champions in our country offices. And let me just say, Blessed is one of 4 amazing women that we have invited from our country offices to attend. We have someone, so Peep Seng from Cambodia, we have Hela Sabah from Tunisia, and you all heard Nhu Nguyen from Vietnam earlier today. So we're engaging with them and many others to try to figure out how do we operationalize the policies now that we have created. We did get inputs on the policies from many people across the organization, but now we need our country offices to help us operationalize these policies and processes. So I'm going to turn it over to Blessed to talk about how do we operationalize at the country office level. Okay.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I'd just like to take this opportunity to say well done to Andrea for leading the JESI team and doing a tremendously good job on the development of the framework. It has been a great head start for us. I think one of the main challenges that we have is if we don't have documentation at policy level, it becomes very difficult to operationalize or to implement. And I would like to believe that apart from the Zambia country office, a lot of other offices have been having challenges in terms of how do we implement this? How do we ensure that we follow the correct guidelines? So what I'm going to do is expand basically on Andrea's last slide and talk about operationalization. But please keep in mind that even as we share these guidelines, it's not something that's cast in stone. It's something that should be suitable to your culture, something that should be suitable to your workplace environment. So basically, the guidelines that we're going to share, which again I said are very flexible and you can adapt them to be suitable to yourselves. The beauty with having such a policy at FHI HQ level is that we can share it not only at our country offices but also with our implementing partners. And for us at the Zambia office, that is what we have done. And because it involves safeguarding of even the beneficiaries, it's important that our implementing partners, our community resource partners, understand what the policies mean and what the implications are. So before I go further, I would just like to pose a question, and get some feedback. What have been your ideas about operationalizing the JESI framework? Those of us who have heard about it, or gender equity and social inclusion. Maybe 1, 2. Is this something that we have thought through, considering we find ourselves at this conference, and that is very significant, it's very pertinent to what we are all doing here? And I think this is actually the heart of the matter, because everything that we've been talking about in there, at the end of the day, has to be implemented on the ground. So the big question is, how do we do that? Do we have any ideas? Yes, I see someone at the back.
I was just going to say, like, remembering to center the needs of your program participants. Like, it's all good and fine to have your internal policies and dictate how you interact with people in communities, but then understanding their context and their needs, because, and this was something that we noticed, because I work in hand washing.
Yes.
So we realized the intersection of the cultural norms of the program and how, if you wanted to be successful in implementing behavior change, we had to prioritize which behaviors were changing. So sometimes the intersection of negative hand washing behaviors with things like gender equity norms in communities was usually a dicey issue, and the implementers would sometimes not know what issues to prioritize. So understanding the local context is really important.
Okay, excellent. Anybody else want to share something? Yes,
I agree with her as well, because each country we have different cultural context and social norm. Another thing that we need to build more people in the country to be like the focal person for the justice
Exactly.
or for gender inclusive, so that we will not only have one person to responsible for that, but people will feel that it is for everyone, not only for one person.
Precisely. So what you've both said is actually very, very important. At the end of the day, we are focusing on protecting our beneficiaries. We are focusing on ensuring that the power up, power down does not disadvantage anyone. And as Sophie had said, it is very important that we consider the cultural context, because the cultural context may be different here in Washington to what it would be like in Lusaka. So it's very important to take that into consideration. So when we look at this process, it's basically a cycle. And the reason why it's a cycle is that it's something that we have to keep reviewing to respond to the needs. Earlier, Andrea had mentioned to say that there are two components. There's the response and there's the prevention. And this all happens at the level of gender integration. The policy level is what we refer to as the gender mainstreaming, which is very, very cardinal because it feeds into the program integration. So the first step ideally is to be able to define your safeguarding objectives and expected outcomes. Now this will be determined by what the two speakers have just spoken about. What are the needs within the communities and the environment that you are working in? They're going to be very different from needs in a different community or in a different project. So it's very, very important in order that the prevention and the response be very objective. So that's the first step. And then the second step would be to develop the safeguarding policies. But in this case, we know that, for instance, for FHI 360, you already have these policies developed. There are a lot of other organizations that don't have any policies that have been developed. But fortunately for our partners that we are working with, we actually allow them to adapt the policy that is already existing than having to completely reinvent the wheel. So from then on, we now trickle down to actually developing the safeguarding plan. So when we say plan, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're planning for sexual harassment, but rather planning on how we are going to prevent and how we are going to respond, which is very, very important, because if we don't have a plan in place, meaning that we are going to be doing things on an ad hoc basis, when we have an issue or a case that has arisen, unless we have specific guidelines in a plan, we will not know how to correctly and effectively respond to these and ensure that the beneficiaries or the victims are safeguarded sufficiently. So after the plan has been developed, again, I'll refer to what Sophie said about having a focal person, and Andrea referred to that as well. It is very, very important, because in the absence of a focal person, there will be no ownership. So this person ideally would be the one who would be coordinating, as we saw it was one of the values, and one also who would act as a whistleblower, and one who also be an ambassador to create awareness. Sophie mentioned to say that it is not an activity for a single individual. It is actually a responsibility for the entire organization. And that's why earlier you heard Andrea talking about trainings and awareness and orientation. It's very, very important that every member of the organization has got the same understanding of why safeguarding is important in the workplace for both the staff as well as the beneficiaries of the program. So the next stage is now to operationalize. This is the stage that actually becomes very tricky, because you can have a beautiful plan in place, but if you don't understand what you are expected to do, it becomes very difficult. I've seen lots of organizations that have beautiful action plans in place, but because they are not applying them, it will never operationalize on its own. People have to be proactive about it. When you're talking about prevention, there are certain things that you need to do to prevent that harmful environment. When you're talking about response, you need to be readily responsive in the event that there is a case that has arisen within your workspace. And then the fifth step, which is very, very important, is to be able to measure the effectiveness of the operationalization. Because sometimes we may have these beautiful plans in place and we just go on implementing them without realizing whether they are effective or not. So as Andrea said earlier, we need to put in certain measures in place to be able to measure whether we have actually achieved our expected outcomes or not. And obviously, in the event that we are not achieving the expected outcomes, we need to go back to the drawing board and see what we can do better and how we can be more effective. And further to that, each country office or partner needs to identify or determine a period within which the organization would like to receive feedback based on how the plan has performed, because sometimes there can be assumption that this plan is working very well, the response is working well, and the prevention is working well, but in the meantime you have people who have actually been victims and their issues have not been addressed and they continue to feel insecure. So this is very, very important so that it goes and feeds back into the policy. Andrea mentioned earlier to say that FHI has had a safeguarding or gender diversity policy in the past, but because of environmental issues and the #MeToo movement, there was need to be responsive to what was happening within the communities that we are working in. So the revision is something that is very, very cardinal to ensure that our policies continue to remain relevant. So this is basically the kind of cycle that we need to look at when we are looking at operationalizing our safeguarding policy. So as I already mentioned, in the event that you already have an existing policy, like for FHI and its partners, it's simply a matter of adapting the same policy. With organizations that don't have, they would prefer to develop their own policies, but obviously it's better not to reinvent the wheel. And at the stage of developing the safeguarding plan, this is when this is now integrated into the programming at the country office level. This is a very, very important element, and it is usually overlooked. I'll give a very simple example. When our projects are being developed, it is very, very rare that you have deliberate integration of gender issues. It is something that comes usually as a by the way. And because of that, what happens is that when you come to implement the activities like the training, the awareness, the sensitization, you don't have any budget line for that because it wasn't planned for. So it's very important from the very beginning, like we plan for every other activities, we need to include a budget line. This is very, very important. That is the only way the gender integration can actually be effective. So at the stage of operationalization, I mentioned to say that it requires to have staff training, orientation for new staff that are coming on board, orientation for implementing partners that are being engaged, orientation for even community volunteers, and also even the beneficiaries need to be sensitized and know what their rights are, know what channels they are able to access in the event that they find themselves in such a predicament. And also, most importantly, to have whistleblowers. That is why it's important that everyone within the organization is familiar with both the policy as well as the country level plan. So I've already talked about the measuring the effectiveness. This basically will have to be obtained from the people who are being affected, the people who are implementing. They're the ones who are going to encounter either challenges or successes and then give feedback in order that we may continue to update and keep current all our policies. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, with regards to developing the safeguarding plan, this is very, very crucial. We may have a beautiful policy in place, but if we do not develop our own plan at country office level, at program level, then it will not be sufficiently effective. So in order to apply ownership, a management model can be used to determine what course of action needs to be taken at a specific point. So I'm going to share with you a brief model that will help you to determine at what point you need to take which action. So it's basically a 4-level quadrant that gives you an idea of what course of action you should take. So ideally, when you look at the safeguarding policy itself in terms of what its benefits are and also what its values are, there are two important elements to look at: the relevance and the importance of the safeguarding policy. So the 4 quadrants are representing organizations. So what you need to do is take your own organization, whether you're an implementing partner or a cooperative partner or whatever relationship it is that you have, or an FHI community resource partner, and I'm able to identify yourself among one of those quadrants. Now how this works is you tell yourself, for instance, if you are an organization that is a red organization, in this case the relevance of safeguarding will be low and the importance of safeguarding would be low. So this simply means that the organization has got no policy and it is not familiar maybe with the FHI 360 policy, and also it may not be important. Now when you look at relevance, this is basically why would something be relevant to you. Something would be relevant to you if it affects you, and in this case we are looking at the external environment. Now we have an issue, and the reason why the hashtag #MeToo has come up is because of various cases that have been identified. So if an organization feels that this is not relevant, then they'll find themselves in the red quadrant, meaning that they're actually in a danger zone and they need to move off from there. So I'll show us what step that organization needs to take. The second one is the blue organization. For a blue organization, the relevance may be low, meaning that they may not feel that they are affected with what is going on in the external environment. They may be oblivious to what is going on, either for lack of knowledge or just not being concerned. And then the importance may be high. That would indicate that maybe they simply don't have a policy. So it may not be relevant, but they actually do have they do not have a policy in place, but it's something that is relevant. So the advantage of this is that they could simply put a policy in place or adapt a policy. So they're at a better space than the red organization. Then at the yellow organization, this would mean that the organization is well aware of what is going on in the environment with regards to the cases and the issues of harassment and discrimination and so on, but the importance is low, meaning that in the organization they probably do or don't have a policy. This means that the organization probably simply feels obliged to respond to the needs of victims or would-be victims. Now the green zone is a good place to be, because with this organization, the organization is fully aware of what is going on in the environment and fully participatory, and also it is very important because it has prioritized it in its strategic plan and has actually developed a safeguarding policy. So all the organizations would like to find themselves in the green zone in order that they may ensure that they are completely inclusive. So in terms of the course of action, I'll show you in the later slide the different guidelines that are recommended to be taken. And again, I said, depending on your environment, depending on your cultural context, and also depending on your priorities and your values, these guidelines may differ. So these are basically just recommendations that organizations can work with. So as I said, when one organization is found in the red zone, the important thing is to first and foremost ensure that there's gender mainstreaming, so that would be the development or the adaptation of a policy. Similar with the blue zone, because we said this organization does not have a policy, the first course of action would be to develop or adapt a policy. And then in the yellow zone, that organization is assumed to have a policy in place and is aware of what is going on in the environment. So what needs to be done is to ensure that there is staff sensitization, the sensitization of partners and all stakeholders that are working within the organization, and safeguarding policies and procedures need to be made aware to staff, both existing as well as new staff. Now in the green zone, all things being equal, this organization is well aware and it's one of the very important values, and the policy is in place. The important thing is to translate that policy into a safeguarding plan and then work from there downwards. So as I said earlier, these are recommended steps that would need to be taken in order for us to operationalize our safeguarding policy. The first one, development of policies, processes and procedures, and then the second one is to train and orient in safeguarding policies, processes and procedures, including new staff orientation. So this should actually be part of all the new staff orientation. So there's no reason why any member of staff should not be aware about these safeguarding policies within the organization. And the third one, very, very important, important is to obtain senior management buy-in. Without this, there can be no ownership, because senior management, even though they would not be responsible for directly driving it, they would give that executive sponsorship. And without that will, it is not possible to actually implement such a policy. And then further on, to create safeguarding awareness, this this should not be a one-off thing. It should be something that is integrated in our day-to-day lives in the workplace. We need to have posters and notices every here and there to ensure that people are sensitized and consciously aware of the issues regarding safeguarding, as well as personal level responsibility. And then the fifth one, as I mentioned, is to develop the safeguarding plan or a workflow that can also be displayed in common areas within the organization that everyone is familiar. In the event that someone comes up who is a victim and makes a report, anyone in the organization should be able to give guidance in terms of what is the next step, who do you need to go to report to, what kind of assistance do you need, etc., etc. And also the integration of safeguarding procedures at country office level and project level. This is the gender integration. And then identifying safeguarding whistleblowers within the organization, as well as ambassadors, and most importantly, the focal person who will be responsible for the coordination of the entire process. And then finally, which is very, very important, is to measure the effectiveness of the safeguarding policy, as well as the plan and the operationalization, because without this, it defeats the whole purpose.
So,
okay.
If I may, so thank you, Blessed. I just wanted to say one thing to the last slide before we go in, because we're going to go into a more interactive session now and put you in small groups and ask you to discuss one of these questions in your groups, and then we'll come back together in a plenary forum to hear some of your conversations. But the one thing that I wanted to mention was one of the next steps for us at FHI 360 is to figure out the best structure for addressing safeguarding across the whole organization. And interestingly, we have been doing a lot of research and investigating on how other organizations are setting up their structures for safeguarding. So for example, in some countries, the Human Resources Department leads this work and kind of organizes it. In other organizations, they're setting up their own safeguarding departments, which bring in HR and their internal compliance units and their gender experts and other champions across the organization. We've also been doing a lot of trying to figure out in terms of investigations, and one of the things I think was on one of the slides is to try to figure out, does your organization have the capacity that it needs to address all of the different elements of prevention and response? And if it doesn't, to be honest with yourselves. Do you need to hire new people with different skills? Do you need to bring in individuals from different departments to weigh in on that whole process, that structure for addressing all of the different issues? And that's one thing that internally we are looking at, and we're trying to kind of come to a decision on the structure of how we're going to now move forward on the operationalization of the safeguarding policies, which is in essence the implementation of the policies. Do you want to do some questions now and then go into groups, or do you want to do questions at the end?